The morning of March 18, 1943, unfolded like any other scheduled training session at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley observed his squadron of student dive bomber pilots as they prepared to board their SPD Dauntless aircraft, the very same robust machines that had played a pivotal role in shifting the momentum of the war at the Battle of Midway just 9 months prior. However, a stark and alarming discrepancy in the statistics gnawed at him. In the preceding 6 weeks alone, Flatley had tragically lost a greater number of aspiring aviators to training-related mishaps than he had experienced in combat fatalities throughout the entirety of the arduous Guadalcanal campaign. This grim reality presented a chilling paradox, underscoring a profound and unsettling problem. A clear and terrifying pattern had emerged, one that defied conventional explanations. These incidents were not attributable to the inexperience of novice pilots or to mechanical malfunctions within the aircraft. Instead, highly seasoned aviators, individuals who had already demonstrated exceptional courage and skill by surviving perilous combat missions, were executing textbook-perfect dive bombing maneuvers directly into the unforgiving ocean. Reports streaming in from other naval air stations across the nation painted an identical and deeply troubling picture. From NAS Corpus Christi to NAS Pensacola, and at various airfields nationwide, dive bomber pilots were perishing under circumstances that defied any logical tactical interpretation. They would initiate their roll into an inverted position, seamlessly transition into their dive, maintain the precise 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, and meticulously track their designated targets through the bomb site. Yet, inexplicably, they would simply fail to execute the pull-out maneuver. There were no frantic radio transmissions indicating distress, nor any erratic flight patterns suggesting a loss of control. The aircraft would steadfastly maintain its steep dive angle, hurtling past the bomb release point, beyond the safe altitude for recovery, until the immutable laws of physics rendered any escape impossible. Subsequent investigations by crash teams consistently revealed intact control surfaces, perfectly functioning engines, and airframes devoid of damage save for the cataclysmic force of impact. It was as if the pilots had momentarily succumbed to sleep at the most critical juncture. But they had not fallen asleep. The insidious phenomenon unfolding within those cockpits was far more complex and alarming than mere fatigue. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please tell us where you are from and what you think about the video topic in the comments below. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been privy to disquieting field reports since the latter part of 1942, but the true magnitude of the issue only became undeniably apparent when numerous squadrons began reporting fatalities due to what official documents euphemistically labeled failure to recover from dive. This carefully worded phrase served to obscure a harsher, more inconvenient truth that no one seemed willing to confront. The very dive bombing methodology that had been instrumental in securing victory at the Battle of Midway was now systematically claiming the lives of the skilled individuals who had mastered it. The meticulous precision and unwavering discipline inherently required for dive bombing to be so devastatingly effective against Japanese naval vessels had, ironically, created a dangerous physiological predicament that the human body was simply not designed to withstand. Commander Flatley initiated discussions and compared observations with his counterparts, other training officers, leading to a profoundly disturbing consensus. The pilots succumbing to these mysterious accidents were not the careless individuals who cut corners or the reckless daredevils who pushed beyond their capabilities. On the contrary, they were the scrupulously precise, by-the-book aviators who adhered strictly to established doctrine. These were the men who held their dives until the absolute last possible second to guarantee maximum accuracy, having fully internalized the brutal mathematical realities of dive bombing. They understood that every additional 100 feet of altitude at the moment of bomb release translated into dozens of feet of potential deviation from the target. Against a rapidly maneuvering enemy warship, such a missed distance could spell the difference between a direct hit and a wasted ordnance. Consequently, these pilots had rigorously trained themselves to wait, to endure that screaming descent, to keep the target perfectly centered in their sights until the penultimate moment before initiating their pullout. And that very discipline, that unwavering commitment to accuracy, was proving fatal, claiming lives in numbers that threatened to cripple the entire dive bomber force. What had not been adequately accounted for, however, was the profound impact on the human body when a formidable 2-ton aircraft transitioned from a 70-degree dive at a blistering 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc. While the underlying physics were straightforward, the physiological repercussions were anything but. When a pilot exerted force on the control stick to commence the pullout, he was not merely altering the aircraft's trajectory. He was subjecting his entire circulatory system to immense gravitational forces that it had never evolved to endure. At the nadir of a typical dive bombing pullout, pilots would experience between 5 and 7 Gs, meaning their blood momentarily weighed 5 to 7 times its normal mass. This blood, inexorably obeying the unforgiving laws of physics, would be forcefully drained away from the brain, pooling instead in the lower extremities and legs. The entire sequence of events unfolded with a speed that surpassed conscious thought. The initial symptom was a loss of peripheral vision, a phenomenon pilots colloquially referred to as grayout. The outer edges of their visual field would gradually dissolve into a colorless, hazy fog as the retinas, deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to cease functioning from the periphery inward. This typically occurred at approximately 4 Gs and afforded the pilot a mere 2 seconds of warning. This was swiftly followed by tunnel vision, where only the central portion of the visual field remained viable, constricting into a narrow circle that rendered instrument readings virtually impossible. At 5.5 Gs, most pilots would experience a complete blackout, a total and abrupt loss of vision while technically retaining consciousness. At 6 Gs and beyond, consciousness itself would begin to wane and ultimately vanish. The brain, receiving perhaps only 30% of its normal blood flow, would simply shut down as a protective mechanism. This is precisely what rendered dive bombing so exceptionally perilous. The entire pull-out maneuver, from its initiation to achieving wings-level flight, typically spanned a duration of 4 to 6 seconds. However, G-induced blackout could commence in less than 2 seconds, with complete unconsciousness potentially following within 4. The timing was nothing short of catastrophic. A pilot would begin his pullout, feel the escalating G-forces, perceive his vision starting to constrict, and then his conscious awareness would abruptly cease at the very moment it was most critically needed. The control stick would go slack, the pullout would halt midway through its arc, and the aircraft would continue its uncontrolled plunge into the water with an unconscious aviator at the controls. Even more tragically, when the G-forces finally abated, either because the aircraft entered a terminal spiral or simply due to the impact with the water, consciousness would sometimes fleetingly return in that final, agonizing second, granting the pilot just enough awareness to comprehend his impending demise. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine swiftly initiated comprehensive tests at the centrifuge facility located in Pensacola, subjecting volunteer pilots to the precise G profiles that had been measured during actual dive bombing pullouts. The findings were profoundly sobering. When pilots were forewarned about the impending high G forces and instructed to consciously tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a technique known to delay blackout by a crucial second or two. They were able to maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise have rendered them unconscious. However, in the intense reality of actual flight, during the final, critical seconds of a dive, with the target rapidly growing larger in their view, and their attention entirely engrossed in keeping the bombsight pipper perfectly centered, pilots invariably neglected to perform the anti-G straining maneuvers. Their conscious minds were simply too saturated with task-specific demands. By the time they began the pullout, it was already too late to adequately prepare their bodies for the crushing forces that were about to be unleashed. Remarkably, the Germans had encountered this identical problem 4 years earlier, and their solution, though brutal, proved remarkably effective. In 1939, during the combat trials of the Ju-87 Stuka over Poland, the Luftwaffe suffered the loss of 7 aircraft within a single week due to unexplained dive accidents. Pilots, who had performed flawlessly in training, were inexplicably plummeting straight into Polish farmland, with their bombs still attached. The subsequent investigation revealed that experienced pilots were blacking out during pullouts at rates that rendered the Stuka operationally unsustainable. However, unlike the Americans, who would grapple with this crisis years later, the Germans had the advantage of an engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudd, who was directly embedded within the design teams at Junkers. And Rudd vehemently advocated for a solution that completely circumvented the human element. By the early months of 1940, every Stuka rolling off the production line was equipped with an automatic pull-out system. The mechanism was elegantly simple in its design. The pilot would preset a desired recovery altitude on a barometric switch before commencing his dive. When the aircraft subsequently reached that predetermined altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically haul the control column backward, irrespective of the pilot's actions. Even if the pilot was completely unconscious or had entirely released his grip on the stick, the aircraft would autonomously recover from the dive. The system incorporated a mechanical override, a prominent red handle that the pilot could pull to regain manual control. However, that override required a conscious decision. If the pilot had blacked out, the automation would seamlessly save his life without any input from him whatsoever. The results were both immediate and dramatic. Stuka loss rates attributable to dive accidents plummeted by over 80% within 3 months of the system's widespread implementation. Pilots frequently recounted instances of feeling the control stick wrench itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some described regaining consciousness in level flight with absolutely no recollection of the preceding 5 seconds. The automatic system also yielded an unanticipated secondary benefit. It permitted pilots to extend their dives for longer durations. The knowledge that the aircraft would automatically recover itself at a preset altitude meant that pilots could keep their bombsights locked onto the target through the final, crucial seconds without the added burden of worrying about manually initiating the pullout. They could focus entirely on achieving maximum accuracy, entrusting the mechanical system to safeguard them from the physiological consequences. However, when American intelligence officers meticulously examined captured Stukas in North Africa between 1941 and 1942, they regrettably dismissed the automatic pull-out system as merely typical German over-engineering. The American aviation community harbored a deep-seated cultural skepticism toward automation. The prevailing ethos was that pilots were expected to actively fly their aircraft, not to delegate such critical functions to machines. The widespread attitude was that properly trained aviators should not require mechanical assistance to prevent blacking out. They should simply strive to be superior pilots. This ingrained perspective persisted even as the mounting pile of accident reports became increasingly alarming. When Navy test pilots evaluated a captured Ju-87 at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their official report noted the presence of the automatic pull-out system, but critically characterized it as a mere crutch for pilots of insufficient skill, rather than recognizing it as an ingenious solution to a fundamental physiological problem. That flawed assessment would tragically cost additional American lives for another 8 agonizing months before the harsh realities of the situation finally compelled a necessary and profound doctrinal shift. The United States Navy experienced a profound doctrinal shift, fundamentally altering its approach to dive bombing tactics. The esteemed Air Group 3 of the USS Yorktown, renowned for its exceptional precision, was comprised not of fledgling aviators fresh from their flight academies, but of battle-hardened veterans who had honed their skills during the arduous Solomons campaign. These accomplished airmen possessed the remarkable ability to precisely deliver a 1,000-pound ordnance package onto the deck of a destroyer from an altitude of 10,000 feet. However, on March 22, 1943, an ostensibly routine training maneuver off the sun-kissed Florida coast took a tragic turn when Lieutenant Robert Chen, piloting his Dauntless dive bomber, failed to execute his pullout. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, observed in horror as Chen's aircraft maintained its steep angle, passing the designated bomb release point and the critical altitude where recovery should have commenced. The Dauntless ultimately impacted the water in a near-vertical plunge, leaving behind almost no salvageable wreckage. This devastating loss marked the squadron's 3rd fatality within a mere 2-week span, and tragically, it would not be the last. Just 5 days later, during the very same training exercise, Lieutenant William Stamper initiated his dive. His radio remained eerily silent, and his aircraft maintained its unyielding trajectory. Onlookers aboard the Yorktown, peering through their binoculars, watched as Stamper's SPD continued its descent past every critical altitude marker, awaiting a pullout that never materialized. The subsequent impact generated a towering plume of white water, visible for many miles across the ocean. Stamper, who had served as Chen's flight instructor, was a seasoned aviator who had miraculously survived the brutal carrier battles of the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. He had accumulated over 300 carrier landings, a testament to his extensive experience, yet he perished during a training exercise he could have effortlessly executed in his sleep. Upon the squadron's return to the Yorktown that afternoon, the commanding officer immediately grounded the entire dive bomber contingent, pending a thorough investigation into these inexplicable losses. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who was at the helm of Fast Carrier Task Force operations, had witnessed enough of these harrowing incidents. He issued a direct order to the Bureau of Aeronautics, instructing them to cease treating these tragic occurrences as isolated accidents and instead to address them as a burgeoning systemic crisis. The ensuing investigation meticulously gathered data from every Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron actively engaged in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters of war. The statistical revelations were nothing short of astonishing. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the Navy had suffered the loss of 47 dive bomber pilots due to pull-out failures during training operations alone. This grim tally surpassed the number of pilots lost to direct enemy action during the identical period. Furthermore, combat squadrons were reporting that a significant proportion, between 15 and 20%, of their pilots experienced at least a partial blackout during operational dives. Several critical combat missions had been severely compromised when section leaders succumbed to unconsciousness during attacks, necessitating their wingmen to disengage from the engagement to safely escort them back to base. In response to this escalating crisis, the Bureau promptly convened an emergency panel at Anacostia Naval Air Station. This distinguished assembly brought together a diverse group of experts, including eminent flight surgeons, innovative aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and courageous pilots who had miraculously survived blackout incidents. For 3 intensive days in early April, these specialists meticulously dissected every preconceived notion they held regarding dive bombing technique. Test pilots undertook instrumented dives, equipped with sophisticated medical monitoring apparatus strapped to their chests, meticulously recording precise data on heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen levels during each distinct phase of the dive and subsequent pullout. High-speed cameras, strategically mounted in chase aircraft, captured the exact moments when pilots' heads would involuntarily slump forward or their hands would release their grip on the control stick. The cumulative evidence proved irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile, as rigorously taught in every Navy flight school, was physiologically unsustainable. Pilots were being systematically trained to execute a maneuver that human biology simply could not reliably endure. A fundamental shift in doctrine was imperative, yet no member of that panel could reach a consensus on how to implement such a change without inadvertently compromising the pinpoint accuracy that rendered dive bombing an indispensable tactical asset in the first place. The pivotal breakthrough emerged from an entirely unforeseen quarter. It did not originate from the revered admirals or the sagacious flight surgeons, but rather from a junior lieutenant named Thomas Riley, who had been flying perilous combat missions from the decks of the USS Enterprise since the Battle of Midway. Riley had surreptitiously begun to employ a technique that flagrantly violated every established principle of dive bombing doctrine, and he had deliberately kept it under wraps, fearing disciplinary action. Instead of initiating his pullout at the prescribed 2,500 feet and releasing his bomb during the nascent phase of the recovery arc, Riley had been extending his dives to 2,000 feet, and on occasion even to an astonishing 1,800 feet, releasing his ordnance at a significantly lower altitude where the aircraft was still nearly vertical. Following the release, he would then execute a more gradual pullout, effectively distributing the punishing G-forces over an extended duration. This unconventional technique stood in stark opposition to the established manual. Conventional wisdom dictated an early release during the pullout to maximize recovery time. However, Riley's bombing scores were inexplicably superior to anyone else in his squadron, and remarkably, he had never once experienced even a partial gray out. When Riley finally elucidated his groundbreaking technique during the Anacostia conference, the initial response was a mixture of skepticism bordering on outright hostility. A commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics flatly accused him of fabricating his release altitudes, asserting that no pilot could achieve consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet, as the existing bombsight calculations did not even account for releases at such low elevations. Undeterred, Riley presented compelling gun camera footage. As the panel meticulously reviewed the film, they witnessed something that directly contradicted everything they thought they understood about bombing accuracy. Riley's bombs consistently struck targets within a circular error probable (CP) of merely 35 feet, a substantially superior performance compared to the 65-foot CP that was traditionally considered excellent for dive bombing. The underlying reason for this remarkable precision became unequivocally clear when aerodynamicists meticulously crunched the numbers. The standard technique involved releasing the bomb early in the pullout arc, when the aircraft was transitioning through an approximate 60-degree dive angle. At this particular angle, the bomb possessed significant horizontal velocity, which necessitated intricate calculations and corrections. Furthermore, wind effects exerted a substantial influence. The bomb's trajectory traced a complex parabolic curve, demanding that the pilot lead the target and meticulously account for a multitude of variables. In stark contrast, Riley's ultra-low releases occurred when the aircraft was still nearly vertical, plummeting between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At this extreme angle, the bomb descended almost straight down with a minimal horizontal component. Wind effects were rendered negligible, and the trajectory was essentially a straight line from the point of release to the point of impact. This ballistic simplicity directly translated into enhanced accuracy. The bombsight mathematics that had previously seemed erroneous for low releases were, in fact, perfectly accurate. They had simply never been properly tested because prevailing doctrine dictated that a pilot would likely perish before reaching such low altitudes. The advantage in terms of G-force management was equally profound. By prolonging the dive and subsequently executing a more gradual pullout, Riley effectively distributed the identical total G-load over a span of 7 or 8 seconds, rather than compressing it into a mere 4 seconds. Consequently, the peak G-forces experienced were significantly lower, hovering around 4.5 Gs instead of the perilous 6 or 7 Gs, thus keeping him safely below the critical blackout threshold. More importantly, the gradual onset of the G-forces afforded his cardiovascular system ample time to compensate. Blood pressure could adjust progressively, allowing him to sustain his anti-G straining throughout the entire maneuver, rather than having it overwhelmed by a sudden, violent spike. This technique undoubtedly demanded exceptional nerve, as it entailed diving deeper into the inherent danger zone before initiating recovery. Nevertheless, the underlying physics were irrefutable. Lower, slower pullouts were demonstrably both safer and more accurate than the established doctrine that was tragically claiming the lives of pilots week after week. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had been diligently conducting wind tunnel research on bomb trajectories since 1941, yet no one had considered applying their invaluable data to ultra-low altitude releases until Riley's groundbreaking technique compelled a comprehensive reevaluation. When NACA engineers at the esteemed Langley Research Center ran the full suite of aerodynamic models, they unearthed a revelation that, in retrospect, should have been self-evident, but had been obscured by decades of entrenched doctrinal assumptions. The standard 2,500-foot release point had never been chosen for its inherent accuracy. Rather, it had been selected primarily for safety. It was intended to provide pilots with the maximum possible time to recover if any unforeseen complications arose. However, this safety margin had been calculated under the false premise that pilots would remain fully conscious and entirely capable throughout the entire pull-out maneuver, an assumption that was now demonstrably false. The extensive wind tunnel data unequivocally revealed why lower releases consistently produce tighter impact patterns. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during a pullout would traverse approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before impacting the target. During this extended flight time, it was susceptible to wind drift, fluctuations in air density, and the intricate aerodynamic interactions between the bomb's stabilizing fins and the turbulent air swirling behind the diving aircraft. Even minute variations in release timing, differences of merely a tenth of a second, could translate into a substantial 15 or 20 feet of missed distance from the intended target. Conversely, a bomb released at 1,800 feet in a nearly vertical attitude would travel perhaps only 40 feet horizontally before impact. The flight time was significantly shorter, the trajectory inherently simpler, and the margin for error dramatically reduced. Release timing variations that would induce significant misses at higher altitudes produced negligible deviation at these lower, more precise altitudes. Empirical confirmation was subsequently provided through meticulous combat footage analysis. The Navy had been assiduously collecting gun camera film from every combat mission since the pivotal Battle of Midway, and this invaluable footage contained frame-by-frame records of thousands of bomb releases, complete with visible impact points. When analysts painstakingly reviewed the film, specifically focusing on release altitudes and their corresponding accuracy, the correlation was undeniable. Pilots who released their ordnance below 2,000 feet, whether intentionally like Riley or inadvertently by extending their dives for too long, consistently achieved impact patterns that were 40% tighter than those achieved by pilots adhering to the doctrinal 2,500-foot release. The absolute lowest releases, those executed between 1,600 and a daring 900 feet, yielded accuracies approaching what had previously only been attainable through glide bombing attacks performed at much lower speeds. The analysis of G-force distribution unveiled the critical distinctions in pilot experience. Specialized accelerometers, meticulously placed within experimental aircraft, provided engineers with precise data on the G-loading profiles associated with recovery maneuvers originating from various altitudes. A recovery initiated at 2,500 feet necessitated an immediate and forceful application of back pressure on the control stick. Given the rapidly diminishing altitude, the aviator was compelled to halt the descent with utmost urgency. This abrupt and intense recovery maneuver invariably produced a significant G-force surge, typically ranging from 6 to 7 gs, which frequently resulted in pilot blackouts. Conversely, a pullout commencing at 1,800 feet permitted a more measured and progressive execution, precisely because of its lower starting point. While the pilot was undeniably closer to the water surface, the aircraft's more vertical orientation afforded a considerably extended arc for the recovery, mitigating the need for an instantaneous, high-G maneuver. Rather than abruptly pulling the control stick rearward, the pilot possessed the latitude to exert a consistent and gentle back pressure, allowing the aircraft to gradually emerge from the dive over an extended duration. This refined technique accomplished the identical change in altitude through the application of considerably milder forces. Consequently, the maximum G-load consistently remained beneath the 5G threshold, a physiological zone where aviators could readily preserve complete awareness and sustain optimal operational capabilities without impairment. We invite you to stay with us and watch the remainder of this compelling video. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please also share a comment below, letting us know where you are from and your thoughts on the topic discussed in the video. While revising established operational doctrine presented one obstacle, the formidable task of re-educating an entire combat aviation corps to execute maneuvers diametrically opposed to their ingrained muscle memory constituted a distinctly different and far greater challenge. To address this, in June 1943, the Navy inaugurated an experimental dive bombing academy at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, operating under the direct oversight of Commander Flatley. The instructional framework was entirely re-envisioned, centering on what was officially termed the delayed pullout technique. Among the pilots, this innovative approach rapidly acquired more colloquial designations, such as riding the edge, or more simply, the late pull. The initial hurdle proved to be profoundly psychological, persuading seasoned aviators that descending to a significantly lower altitude prior to recovery was not a suicidal act of recklessness, but rather, paradoxically, the inherently safer methodology. The instructional regimen commenced with classroom instruction that bore a stronger resemblance to rigorous physics seminars than conventional flight briefings. Pilots attended detailed presentations elucidating G-induced loss of consciousness, which included intricate charts illustrating blood flow dynamics during high-G maneuvers and comprehensive graphs correlating the rates of G-force onset with the likelihood of experiencing a blackout. Furthermore, expert flight surgeons meticulously clarified the precise physiological impact on the human visual system when the retina suffered from oxygen deprivation. The instructors diligently ensured that each pilot fully grasped that the efficacy of this new technique transcended mere courage or individual piloting prowess. Fundamentally, it was a matter of human biology. Even the most valorous and adept pilot globally would inevitably experience a blackout at 6 gs if the recovery maneuver was executed too aggressively and too swiftly. The overarching objective was not to combat the immense G-forces head-on, but rather to skillfully regulate and distribute them over a more extended temporal period, thereby allowing the body to physiologically acclimate instead of succumbing to a systemic shutdown. Following the theoretical groundwork, the training transitioned to intensive instrument practice. This novel methodology demanded that aviators place absolute faith in their altimeters, particularly in scenarios where every primal instinct urged an immediate and abrupt recovery. Instructors guided pilots through extensive drills within link trainers, which were rudimentary flight simulators, where they repeatedly executed dive profiles while vocalizing their current altitudes without interruption. Passing 3,000, maintaining dive angle. Passing 2,500, maintaining dive angle. Passing 2,000, target in sight, steady, 1,800, initiating pullout. These continuous verbal declarations served to keep their conscious faculties fully engaged and effectively counteracted the onset of tunnel vision, a common precursor to critical altitude awareness loss. Aviators honed these callouts until they became an ingrained, automatic verbal rhythm, sustained even under the most extreme psychological pressures. The practical flight training itself introduced the innovative technique through meticulously phased, graduated stages. Initial flights involved simulated dives without live ordnance, with recovery maneuvers commencing at 2,200 feet, a mere 300 feet lower than the previously mandated doctrine. Instructors, flying alongside in chase aircraft, provided incessant radioed updates on altitude. Pilots progressively acquired the ability to discern the precise visual indicators correlating to 1,800 feet, the apparent size of the target, the configuration of the horizon, and the distinct sight picture that signaled the opportune moment for recovery. They diligently practiced the gradual pullout, mastering the application of consistent, steady back pressure rather than an abrupt yank of the control stick. Furthermore, they engaged in rigorous anti-G straining exercises, initiating these physiological efforts prior to the pullout and sustaining them throughout the entire recovery sequence. This included learning to exhale with forceful grunts during each breath, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal musculature to effectively retain blood circulation within the upper regions of the body. By August of 1943, the Naval Air Station Jacksonville facility was successfully graduating aviators who consistently executed bomb releases from altitudes ranging between 1,700 and 900 feet, achieving circular error probables of less than 40 feet and experiencing absolutely no G-induced physiological incidents. While this enhanced training regimen extended 3 weeks beyond the duration of the former curriculum, the resultant improvements were undeniably conclusive. Air squadrons integrating these newly proficient pilots reported significant accuracy enhancements, ranging from 35 to 50%, in stark contrast to units still employing conventional dive bombing methods. Crucially, the rate of training accidents plummeted to virtually zero. Although the inherent danger of diving to 1,800 feet before initiating recovery still demanded every fiber of a pilot's discipline and evoked considerable apprehension, The critical outcome was that they were no longer perishing. The effectiveness of this refined technique was unequivocally proven, necessitating its rapid implementation by the Navy across every carrier air group stationed in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters prior to the commencement of the next significant military engagement. The delayed pull-out technique underwent its inaugural comprehensive combat evaluation during Operation Forager, specifically the Marianas invasion in June 1944. Task Force 58 deployed a formidable contingent of 15 fleet carriers into the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, with every single dive bomber squadron having undergone rigorous retraining in the updated doctrine over the preceding 8-month period. On June 19, amidst the pivotal engagement that would subsequently be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers encountered their definitive trial and achieved ultimate vindication. Japanese aircraft carriers unleashed a barrage of massive aerial assaults, which swiftly overwhelmed the American combat air patrol controllers. Consequently, an urgent directive was issued for dive bombers to retask from their primary objective of attacking enemy vessels to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike formations before they could menace the American fleet. What ensued was an unparalleled demonstration of precision under the most demanding combat circumstances. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage spearheaded Bombing Squadron 10, operating from the USS Enterprise, in an assault against a formidable formation of Japanese carrier bombers positioned at 12,000 feet, an elevation previously deemed, at best, marginal for effective dive bombing. Employing the newly adopted delayed pull-out technique, his aviators commenced their dives from this considerable altitude, maintaining their descent directly through the core of the Japanese formation, and executing bomb releases at altitudes below 2,000 feet, while still hurtling earthward at velocities exceeding 280 knots. The resultant bombing accuracy proved absolutely devastating. Subsequent post-action analysis attributed to VB-10 the destruction or damage of 23 Japanese aircraft in a solitary pass, a level of precision that would have been utterly unattainable with the former high-altitude release methodology. Ramage's personal ordnance struck a K-torpedo bomber with such pinpoint accuracy that the ensuing explosion dispersed debris across a quarter-mile expanse. Remarkably, not a single pilot within his squadron reported even a partial blackout during their recovery maneuvers. The comprehensive statistical data derived from the Marianas operation unequivocally narrated the full narrative of success. Dive bomber squadrons, rigorously trained in the delayed pull-out technique, attained remarkable hit rates of 32% when engaging agile warships, a substantial improvement over the historical averages of 18 to 22% observed in preceding naval engagements. During the intense assaults against Japanese carriers on June 20th, bombs deployed from altitudes below 2,000 feet were responsible for 14 of the 18 direct hits, officially documented by American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier HIO, for instance, sustained 3 rapid successive bomb strikes from VB-2 pilots, all of whom executed their releases between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. These munitions penetrated the flight deck with such astonishing precision that 2 separate bombs entered the very same elevator shaft. The carrier subsequently succumbed and sank within a matter of hours, and a post-war forensic examination of the wreckage revealed impact patterns tightly clustered within a 50-foot radius, an unparalleled degree of accuracy that would have appeared entirely unachievable merely 18 months prior. Correspondingly, pilot survival statistics exhibited an equally profound enhancement during the 6-month period immediately subsequent to the widespread adoption of delayed pull-out training. Incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness plummeted by an astonishing 91% across all operational carrier air groups. Furthermore, combat loss rates directly attributable to dive bombing accidents diminished to statistically negligible levels, fewer than one pilot per 1,000 sorties, a stark contrast to the alarming rate of 15 per 1,000 observed during the dire early months of 1943. This innovative technique had not only entirely resolved the pervasive blackout crisis but, more significantly, it had fundamentally redefined the operational capabilities and strategic impact of dive bombing as a military tactic. The newly acquired capacity to accurately release ordnance from extremely low altitudes conferred upon dive bombers the capability to engage targets that had historically necessitated the deployment of multiple squadrons. A solitary aircraft could now effectively achieve mission kills against destroyers, while a two-plane section possessed the potency to incapacitate cruisers. By the advent of the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, the delayed pull-out methodology had become so intrinsically woven into the fabric of dive bomber doctrine that fledgling aviators arriving from training command were entirely unaware that any alternative technique had ever existed. From their inaugural training flight, they had been instructed to prolong their dives to 1,800 feet, rendering the antiquated high-altitude releases appear dangerously imprecise by comparison. The conclusive statistical data emanating from the Pacific War unequivocally demonstrated that dive bombers, whose crews had been rigorously trained in the delayed pull-out technique, successfully sank or damaged an astounding 47% more enemy shipping per sortie than squadrons still employing pre-1943 operational methods. This superior performance was achieved with markedly reduced loss rates, significantly improved pilot survival statistics, and a level of accuracy that fundamentally reconfigured the dive bomber from a broad-area weapon into an instrument of exceptional precision. The very technique that had been perceived as suicidally perilous in 1943 had, by this point, evolved into the definitive benchmark against which all other aerial bombing methodologies were evaluated. The audacious aviators, who had learned to prioritize the immutable laws of physics over primal instinct, who had meticulously disciplined themselves to prolong those terrifying, screaming dives for merely a few seconds longer than every fiber of their being urged them to recover, had effectively revolutionized the established tenets of naval aviation. Their profound achievement was realized through the mastery of pulling out late.